The Mirage of Progress: Why Black Women's Victories Don't Equal Systemic Change. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I want to begin by acknowledging the profound wisdom and unapologetic truth telling of Connie Littles, whose work has fundamentally reshaped how we understand racial equity and economic justice in America. Connie embodies what it means to speak truth to power. Her unique blend of Detroit resilience and New York adaptability has made her not just an advocate, but a visionary who refuses to accept symbolic victories when real transformation is needed. When Connie speaks, systems listen. When systems don't listen, she makes them listen. Her ability to cut through the noise and identify the gap between celebration and substantive change has awakened countless leaders to a more honest evaluation of our progress. We love celebrating firsts, don't we? The first Black woman to become this, the first to achieve that. These moments feel good. They make great headlines. They give us hope that things are changing. But what if I told you that these celebrated milestones, these moments we point to as evidence of progress, might actually be distracting us from a more troubling reality? What if our focus on these symbolic victories is preventing us from seeing how fragile this progress really is? This is the uncomfortable truth that emerged from my conversation with Connie Littles. And it's what I want to explore with you today. We're living in a time of apparent contradictions. On one hand, we've witnessed historic breakthroughs. Black women have achieved record representation in state legislatures. For the first time, two Black women are serving simultaneously in the U.S. Senate. These are achievements worth celebrating. But beneath these visible signs of advancement lies a more complex story, one where progress is neither linear nor secure. Consider this. In 2025, Angela Also Brooks from Maryland and Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware made history as the first two Black women serving together in the U.S. Senate. Their elections doubled Black women's presence in that chamber and inspired a new generation of leaders. But their path wasn't easy. Both faced entrenched skepticism about their electability. Both encountered limited access to traditional funding channels. Both had to overcome systemic barriers that questioned whether a double breakthrough was even possible within one election cycle. Their success required extraordinary effort, leveraging grassroots organizing networks built over years by organizations like Higher Heights Leadership Fund and focusing on coalition building across diverse communities. Their victories didn't happen because the system suddenly became fair. They happened despite a system that remains fundamentally unequal. And here's where the story gets more complicated. While we were celebrating these historic elections, something else was happening. In early 2025, sweeping federal executive orders dismantled diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across government agencies. By mid year, over 69,000 federal positions were cut, many held by Black women who had sought stability through public sector work. The unemployment rate among Black professional women rose steadily, while other groups remained stable. The racial wealth gap widened, and decades of progress toward economic mobility began to unravel. This is the reality Connie Littles wants us to confront. Progress is not permanent. Even with historic gains in political representation, systemic barriers, including wage gaps and policy rollbacks, continue to hinder true equity for Black professional women. We're conditioned to believe that progress moves in one direction, forward, that once a barrier is broken, it stays broken. That representation naturally leads to transformation. But what if that's not true? What if progress is more like a tide that can recede as quickly as it advances? What if representation without structural change is just an illusion of progress? These questions might make us uncomfortable. They should, because they challenge us to look beyond the inspiring stories and examine whether our institutions are actually becoming more equitable. The truth is, representation matters, but it isn't enough. Seeing Black women in leadership positions is inspiring. It creates role models. It expands our collective imagination about who belongs in positions of power. But sustainable change requires more than individual breakthroughs. It demands ongoing investment in inclusion policies and protections against discrimination at every level of society. Let me share another example that illustrates this point. The New York State Legislature has seen significant advances in recent years, thanks largely to sustained efforts led by figures such as Andrea Stewart Cousins, the state's first female Senate Majority Leader, and allied organizations focused on pay equity campaigns for Black working professionals. Since 2019, these advocates have successfully pushed state lawmakers to pass bills targeting wage transparency and reporting requirements while expanding resources available through community based legal aid. But even with this progress, systemic wage disparities persist. The gap remains, though high profile annual events like Black Women's Equal Pay Day have kept focus sharp, even amid a hostile national climate. What makes this example powerful is that it shows both the possibility and the limitation of progress. New York's experience demonstrates that local activism and leadership matter regardless of macro headwinds. Laws passed increased accountability measures statewide, even when federal protections faltered elsewhere. But it also reveals how much work remains. Despite a decade of incremental wins and broader coalitions between business leaders and policymakers, Black women still earn significantly less than their white counterparts for the same work. This is the reality we must confront. Economic justice demands vigilance. Closing racial wealth gaps means fighting not just for access, but also for enforcement of equity initiatives and refusing to let setbacks define our future trajectory. As Connie Littles emphasized in our conversation, we need to shift our understanding of progress itself. We need to recognize that celebrating symbolic victories without securing structural change leaves us vulnerable to backsliding. We need to acknowledge that the narrative of advancement often overlooks how quickly progress can be undermined by shifts in political priorities or economic downturns, disproportionately affecting Black women's job security and wealth building opportunities. This isn't about diminishing the importance of representation. It's about recognizing that representation alone isn't enough to create lasting change. So, what does this mean for us? How do we move forward with clear eyes about both the possibilities and the limitations of progress? First, we need to redefine success. Instead of focusing exclusively on individual breakthroughs, we need to measure progress by how well our institutions protect and advance equity for everyone, especially during times of political or economic pressure. Second, we need to build resilient systems. This means creating policies and practices that don't depend on the goodwill of current leadership, but are embedded in our institutional structures. Third, we need to practice what Connie calls strategic vigilance. This means celebrating victories while simultaneously preparing to defend them. It means recognizing that progress requires both offensive and defensive strategies. And finally, we need to embrace a longer timeline for change. Real transformation doesn't happen overnight or even over a few years. It requires sustained commitment across generations. This perspective might seem discouraging at first. If progress is so fragile, why bother fighting for it? But I believe there's actually profound hope in this more complex understanding of change. When we recognize that progress isn't automatic or irreversible, we stop taking it for granted. We become more strategic about how we secure and defend it. We build stronger coalitions that can weather political shifts. And perhaps most importantly, we develop the resilience to continue fighting even when we experience setbacks. The story of Black women's advancement in America has never been a straight line. It has always been a series of breakthroughs, followed by backlash, progress, followed by resistance. What's different now is that we have the opportunity to learn from this pattern. We can anticipate resistance rather than being surprised by it. We can build systems designed to withstand backlash rather than assuming progress will maintain itself. This is the wisdom Connie Littles brings to this conversation. A clear eyed assessment of both how far we've come and how vulnerable that progress remains. For too long, Black women have been expected to be the strong ones, leading movements, supporting communities, breaking barriers, often without adequate support or recognition. The narrative of individual achievement has placed the burden of progress on their shoulders while absolving institutions of their responsibility to create equitable systems. It's time for a different approach, one that celebrates individual breakthroughs while simultaneously demanding institutional transformation, one that recognizes both the power of representation and its limitations. I stand before you today not to diminish our victories, but to demand that we make them matter, not just for today's headlines, but for tomorrow's reality, not just for those who break through glass ceilings, but for those who still find the door locked. The question isn't whether we should celebrate progress, it's whether we're willing to protect it, to fortify it, to demand that our institutions make it permanent. I challenge each of you to leave here today with a commitment to move beyond the comfortable celebration of symbolic victories, to ask the harder questions about structural change, to hold our institutions accountable not just for who sits at the table, but for how the table itself is built. Will you advocate for transparency in hiring and promotion practices at your workplace? Will you support organizations fighting for economic justice in your community? Will you hold elected officials accountable for protecting and advancing equity initiatives? Progress isn't inevitable, it isn't permanent. And it certainly isn't just about representation, it's about transformation, it's about justice, and it requires all of us to see beyond the mirage of progress to create the reality of change. Thank you.